Hi, and welcome to our podcast on damp and mould in social housing. I'm Beth McKeown, I'm a solicitor at MSB, and I'm here with my colleague Louise Murphy, who is head of the social housing and regeneration team. Hi, Lou.
Hi, Beth. Thank you for having me today.
No problem. So we'll just get straight into it. Do landlords have a duty to ensure that properties are healthy and safe to live in?
Yes. So a landlord has a number of legal duties, some of which relate to the safety of the property. The rights and responsibilities of a landlord tend to lie in statute or in contract. So for statute, we're looking at Acts of Parliament, and for the contract, we're talking about the tenancy agreement. So the main Act of Parliament that's relevant for housing conditions is the Landlord and Tenant Act. And we have within that Act, Section 11, which states that a landlord is responsible for ensuring that a property is in a state of repair in terms of its structure, exterior and installations. There is also a provision within that Act under Sections 9 and 10, which states that the property must be fit for human habitation. We tend to find that the repairing obligations within the tenancy agreement are mirrored on the statutory provisions. So usually, again, they would dictate that we must keep the property in a state of repair in terms of its structure and exterior. And those provisions, those legal duties, speak to the safety of a property.
And does this include damp and mould?
Yes. So damp, as we know, can have a number of causes. If the cause of the damp relates to the structure, because under Section 11 we're responsible for the structure of the property, we're then responsible for any resulting dampness. So what we find is if the dampness is rising dampness, for example, because the rising dampness is within the structure of the building and within the plaster, we are then responsible for that. If the dampness or the moisture in the property is as a result of penetration from water, from the roof, from rain, then because there's a defect with the roof, that is the structure, we're responsible for that as well. And in same terms, if the moisture, the dampness in the property is because of a water escape from, for example, the bath, because we're responsible for the installations, we are then responsible for the damp or the moisture that is present there. That position has been relatively settled in law for some 20 or 30 years. We've been responsible for damp or moisture in a property that it's arisen as a structural defect for a while. What we've seen in recent years following the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation Act is a slight change in responsibilities. So that Act amended Sections 9 and 10 of the Landlord and Tenant Act to include provision for a landlord to ensure that the property is fit for human habitation at the point that it's let, but also for the duration of the tenancy. And in considering whether the property is fit for human habitation, we have to have regard as to whether it's defective in relation to a number of factors. And three of those factors really are relevant for the discussion around damp and mould. The first is that we must have consideration as to whether there is damp and mould in the property. We must consider ventilation, and we must also look at whether it's defective in terms of any hazards. The final element of that statutory test is also that the property must not be reasonably suitable for occupation in that condition. So there must be it must be defective in one of those areas, but then it must not be reasonably suitable for occupation in that condition. So what we've seen is a shift because that statutory provision does not say that the cause of the dampness must be structural. It just merely says the presence of dampness. So what that has done, arguably, is bring condensation, dampness and mould into the landlord's repairing responsibilities. Whereas to some extent, prior to that Act, it was limited to dampness caused by the structure and exterior.
And what are some of the health risks that are associated with damp and mould?
So I'm not a doctor, so I can only give you my layman's view on that. And don't sue me if it's wrong either. But, common sense would dictate that if there was damp and mould in the property, it could have an impact on a person's chest, or they may suffer from respiratory problems, because it is well known that can have a potential negative impact. And obviously the impact of the presence of damp and mould in a property where someone is particularly vulnerable because of a pre-existing medical condition, or potentially old or young, the impact may be greater.
And if damp and mould is notified to a landlord, what should they then do with that notice?
So it's really important that if we're told by a customer, a tenant, that there is damp and mould in the property, that firstly that is recorded accurately on our on a landlord's system, and that following that report, the problem is diagnosed properly. So we don't just assume when they phone and they say they can see mould that it's a pure condensation problem and send them out for a mould wash, that we actually make sure that there's no underlying structural problem, or that there's not a requirement for improved ventilation of that property. So we must record it adequately, and then we must act upon it. And that's important because from a legal perspective, a landlord is arguably only liable for a problem with damp and mould if they're told about it, or if they know about it. Notice can be expressed or implied, or constructive notice. But for this purpose, when they're told about it, that's quite an express notice. So once they're told about it, they then have a reasonable period of time to fix it. And at the moment, there isn't a set timescale for what is a reasonable period of time. And we're usually dictated to by an organisation's internal policies around that topic. And it's important that organisations understand that they have to comply with their internal policy. So if their policy says they will deal with an emergency repair within 48 hours, for example, then it's done. If they would, do a general repair within 20 working days, then it's done in that period of time. Because if we don't fix the problem within a reasonable period of time, after we've been told about it, that's when a potential housing condition claim could arise in the classic Section 11 type claim.
Do you think that landlords should be proactive in preventing damp and mould from occurring in the first place?
Yeah, most definitely. The Housing Ombudsman is really keen on a cultural shift within the sector, from reaction to proactiveness. And historically what would happen was there would be a report to a landlord of damp and mould. They would go out and hopefully deal with it. What we're seeing now is particularly the Housing Ombudsman and the regulator encouraging the sector to go out and find the stock, the types of properties that have inherent problems with damp and mould, and to look for solutions to that fabric problem within that property. So we must be proactive. We need to be undertaking property MOTs, property visits, stock condition surveys, even stock data, collating stock data and analysing that data so that we can identify the pockets of properties which we know have a problem with damp and mould, either because of the way they were constructed, or because of the way the land is, or because of the way the boilers are. There's a whole range of reasons why certain properties have certain problems, and it's understanding that and then putting a solution in place. What I will say is we do, as a sector, need to be more proactive, but it's all well and good going out and finding the problem. We must ensure that there is strategic vision, there is finance in place, resources in place to solve the problem. And also expertise. So, if there is an issue in a particular type of stock and we identify it, that's not the end of it. Yeah. It's ensuring that we've got the team in place, the specialist team to fix it, or the contractor to fix it, the funds to fix it, the decant properties available to move people out if needs be, so that it's a whole strategic plan around damp and mould. And again, moving from that reaction to proactive. And there's some merit realistically in organisations setting up specialist teams to deal with these issues in properties.
And what are some of the other challenges? Obviously, you've touched on having the finances available to deal with the damp and mould. What are some of the other challenges that landlords are going to face with damp and mould?
Sometimes properties are just built bad. You know, we've seen them, haven't we, in practice, Beth? We see the same problems in certain property types and property styles. They are just built, you know, a number of years ago. You know, they could be, you know, realistically 80 years old, and they were just built for a different time. They don't have adequate ventilation. They may be over occupied. The occupants may not be able to heat that property. So it's about finding solutions to prevent that damp and mould from continuing to occur. And it may mean the installation of, I don't know, for example, a new heating system that's more efficient. It may mean the installation of a positive ventilation system to reduce condensation. It may mean having a really good proactive rehousing policy, which moves people into housing so that they're not over-occupied. None of these issues are easily solved.
No.
We can sit here and give all these ideas. I appreciate on the ground they're actually really, really tough societal problems to solve. But just because it's tough doesn't mean as a sector we should shy away from that. We should face it, we should embrace it, and we should move forward to improve properties for the customers. I think the other point as well is that the Ombudsman refers to zero tolerance to damp and mould. I had a chat with the Ombudsman about this at a conference a couple of months ago, and I was trying to understand it, because a zero tolerance approach to damp and mould is something different to zero tolerance to damp and mould. So it's about having a zero tolerance approach to it. I think the Ombudsman understands that there is going to be damp and mould in the properties. It's about ensuring that that becomes unacceptable and that we solve it. And again, that is to some extent about getting out there, being proactive, identifying and solving the problems within these properties so far as possible, and having that zero tolerance approach. And over the years, having practiced in housing conditions and disrepair for a long time, we come across these really tricky properties that are just built poorly or do not have, adequate ventilation. Or the more difficult property styles is where, for example, it might be one within a block, but we don't own the block. We're on the leaseholder, so there's a limit to what we can do. There's not been a problem that in practice we've come across that we've not been able to eventually solve. They may not be solved easily. And there's a couple coming to mind actually that we deal with day to day that we think, how are we going to solve this? Or how's the client or the surveyor going to find a solution? But there's always a solution. And it's about not giving up and having that zero tolerance approach to it. It's not good enough, and that needs to be resolved.
Now, if we could turn our attention to the potential upcoming changes under Awaabs law, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Yeah,
so obviously following the tragic death of Awaab, the sector and society has begun to ask questions about social housing and the existence of damp and mould, and rightly so. And there's been an amendment tabled to the Social Housing and Regulation Bill, which would require social landlords to fix health hazards or defects within a set time frame. So at the moment, the proposal is that once a social landlord is told about the health hazard of the defect, that they have 14 days to diagnose it and then 7 days to fix it. Now, those time frames are under consultation. We don't know whether they will change or whether there will be exact timescales in the Act. Possibly it'll come in further regulation, but I think it's certainly a change that we need to embrace as a sector, and we need to ensure that we plan for that.
So how would you advise social housing staff to prepare for these upcoming changes?
So I think if you work in the social housing sector, it really does depend whereabouts within that sector you work.
Yeah.
If you are at board level, you need to be thinking, obviously, from a strategic governance perspective. Do we have sufficient finance? Do we have the resources? Have we got the right culture? Do our aims and policies all fit around where we need to be in terms of damp and mould? So I think that's really important. But from a more day-to-day perspective, what strikes me sometimes is the record keeping within organisations. Is that fit for purpose? Are we adequately recording what we're being told or what we are finding? Because remember, we should be being proactive. Because if we are being proactive, but we're not adequately recording what we're finding, how are we then able to assess data and trends if we're simply putting damp in a property? Because we know that damp can be caused by a whole range of factors. So it's ensuring that the record keeping is good. And then I think as a sector, we need to be looking at this real culture shift. That I've mentioned this, but proactive instead of reactive, transparency, looking and finding for problems rather than waiting for them to be presented to us, putting the customer first above everything, else, and ensuring that from the culture within an organisation, that all feeds into this overriding objective, which is to ensure that homes, are fit for purpose and fit for human habitation, and that we're providing good quality homes for people.
Well, that brings us to an end to our podcast today on damp and mould in social housing. So thank you very much, Louise, for joining me. And thank you to our listeners. If you need any more information on this or you have any questions at all, feel free to contact us, or you can go onto our website at MSB Solicitors.
Also follow our LinkedIn page.
And follow our LinkedIn page and Instagram and Twitter.